The symposium is about prostate cancer in African American men. It's myself talking about this disparity in screening and early disease. Tia Gano from the University of Washington is going to be talking about disparities in advanced disease, and my former research partner Shiv Srivastava from the Uniformed Services University is going to be talking about basic science as it applies to prostate cancer in African American men. Screening for African American men, quite frankly, is in a little bit of a disarray in the sense that the PSA, or prostate-specific antigen blood test, has been available, since about 1989 or 1990. And for the first 15 years or so, medical groups generally supported PSA testing for screening for prostate cancer. Over the last 7 to 10 years, the whole controversy has come to light because the U.S. Preventative Services Task Force about 10 years ago started to whittle away at the PSA test, and ultimately about 5 years ago gave the PSA test a D rating, meaning they thought there was more harm than good. And so this symposium is going to explore, at least my talk is going to explore, whether that's been a good thing or a bad thing, especially for African American men. And I'm going to try to paint the picture that it's probably not a good thing, that we have this African American male population who is at definite higher risk for developing prostate cancer, have traditionally had a higher risk of advanced disease, a higher risk of death from prostate cancer, and then the federal agency or the U.S. Preventative Services Task Force comes along and says, we really shouldn't screen for this disease for anybody. And I think we really need to perhaps take a second look at that, specifically as it applies to high-risk groups such as African American men. The issue of, did this decision that they made in 2012 to give the PSA test a D rating, has that made any difference? Takes a long time for prostate cancer. It's a slow-growing cancer and perhaps takes 10 years or 15 years to get the answer. But we're starting to see some generalized data, not just for African American men, but for men in general, that when you stop doing the PSA test, number one, you don't detect as many prostate cancers, so the rate of prostate cancer or the incidence has gone down. But you also see a stage migration, or what we call a reverse stage migration, where the risk of being diagnosed with advanced disease is going up. Then the $64,000 question is, that stage migration going to translate into a worse survival in a couple years from now? But unfortunately, we don't have any good specific data on African American men, and one of the purposes of this symposium is really to try to come to ACR and point out the problem, point out the disparity, not just in screening, but in studying this disease and trying to get researchers to take this on as a key research topic. I'm going to be presenting some data in the symposium on data that we've collected from Duke University. Now, I have data from the early PSA era, from about 1990 through about 2008, when this whole thing went down against PSA. And what I showed from 1990 till 2008 in a major medical center in the southeastern United States, where we have a large African American population, is we were making a difference. We were starting to see the gap between black and white patients narrow, such that by the last data that we collected before the data against PSA, we were seeing close to the same staging for men who underwent surgery and similar PSA levels. So we saw this improvement, but I have not collected data yet to see how it's gone in the reverse direction, since we've not done as much PSA testing. So the U.S. Preventative Services Task Force based their D recommendation, meaning more harm than good, on 2 randomized trials. One that was from the United States called the PLCO trial, and that was a negative study, meaning they didn't see any difference in survival rates between men who had been screened and men who didn't get screened, but that was a majority white population. Similarly, well, a European randomized trial for screening was the second randomized trial, and that showed a benefit in favor of screening of about 20-25%, again, primarily in Caucasian men from Europe. But we have no really solid data in African American men. This is one of the problems, that the two randomized controlled trials were primarily in Caucasian populations, very low African American population. What's surprising to me is that despite all this research funding for prostate cancer and all the hype about this, that no one has proposed or started a randomized trial for screening specifically in African American men. And you'd think if the U.S. Preventative Services Task Force thinks that the PSA test is not that good, then perhaps a screening trial in African American men would be the right thing to do, or at least be ethical. On the other hand, there are some people who believe that it's just intuitively obvious that African American men have a poor outcome for prostate cancer, and they've even contended that it would be unethical to do a randomized screening trial in African American men. So, isn't that interesting? So we need the data, but yet there's assumptions made that clearly African American men need to be screened, and so there's some people who would have inertia about doing the trial because they say we shouldn't, it's not ethical to do it. So it's a great question about whether this is due to behavior or biology or a combination of both. In the symposium, we're going to generally support that it's a multifactorial thing, that African American men with prostate cancer do worse because of lack of screening, lack of access, and those type of things, but it also may have to do with some underlying biological basis. And so Dr. Srivastava is going to explore the myriad of molecular biologic studies that have been done looking at tumor samples from African American and Caucasian patients. And then Dr. Hagano is going to also look at some of the existing clinical trials in advanced prostate cancer, looking at African American versus non-African American populations. The only other things that I think are quite interesting is that, again, if you look at these potential biological differences to see if there are any true molecular differences between the tumors in the two different populations, but yet you look at some of the advanced prostate cancer clinical trials, and there's actually some very interesting data that came out in the last year on Sipuleucel T, which is the immunotherapy that's been FDA approved to treat prostate cancer since 2010. The trade name on that product is Provenge, and it's the only immunotherapy that's FDA approved for prostate cancer. Interestingly, there's a database called the ProSeed Registry that looks at a large group of men who've been treated with this immunotherapy, and actually found that African American men do significantly better with this immunotherapy than did the Caucasian men, even risk stratified by other disease characteristics. So that's really intriguing that despite this worse stage of disease, screening disparity and so forth, higher death rate, here's a cancer treatment where the African American patients did better. So it opens up a whole line of research questions and just points to the fact that, again, we're so honored that AACR allowed us to put this symposium on, and it really brings to light this really important public health issue of African American men with prostate cancer.